Ladies and gentlemen, we actually have a global problem now with politics, and that is politics these days is nothing more than theatrics. Nobody actually has a coherent narrative. Nobody actually has a coherent set of principles. Now, nothing exemplifies this more than the Israeli-Gaza conflict. Let us not forget that the conflict started on the 7th of October when Hamas invaded Israel, killed a large number of individuals, and took a large number of individuals back to Gaza as hostages in order to strong-arm Israel to get their own way. Now, since then, let us not forget that a number of these hostages have died, some have been released underneath negotiations, and there are still some hostages in Gaza this minute who Hamas refused to release. Now, as you know, in retaliation, Israel launched a military operation against Hamas. So, in the latest news, Britain has banned Israeli officers from its Royal College of Defense Studies for the first time since 1927. Now, the move is being framed as a response to Israel's carnage in Gaza, where tens of thousands have been killed. But at the same time, the US Foreign Office insists that Israel is not committing genocide, saying that the threshold of intent underneath the Geneva Convention hasn't yet been met. And that's because the Israelis don't want to commit genocide in the same ways they say the Nazis wanted to genocide the Jews. Instead, what they're trying to do is, well, get rid of Hamas, an internationally classed terrorist organization, and free their captives, in other words, the hostages, the Israeli citizens. Now, this contradiction in itself is theatrical. You punish Israel symbolically while avoiding the legal burden of calling it genocide. Britain wants to look tough abroad, but not risk breaking its ties with the US or being legally bound to sanctions. Now, into the scene walks President Isaac Herzog. His London visit is pitched as an anti-Semitic solidarity tour with the Jewish community, but the backdrop is awkward. UK politicians quietly urge Starmer not to meet him, citing Gaza. Meanwhile, Mohammed Abbas is welcomed in Downing Street, where Britain flirts with recognizing a Palestinian state. This jewel-case choreography shows how politics has just become theatrical. One leader receives applause, is the leader from the Palestinian Authority, while the other politely avoided. Now, just to be clear, President Isaac Herzog is actually an Israeli politician. So depending on which audience is playing, you actually get a different response. Now, this in itself is actually becoming quite alarming because the United Nations has now condemned Israel as having committed genocide in Gaza. Now, the UN Commission of Inquiry released a 72-page report formally accusing Israel of genocide. It says Israel has committed 4 of the 5 genocidal acts defined underneath international law. That is, killing civilians en masse, inflicting conditions that ensure destruction of a group, blocking aid and food, creating famine, and destroying Gaza's healthcare system. Now, Netanyahu and Herzog themselves have been named personally as having incited genocide. And evidence includes statements comparing Gaza's operations to holy walls of annihilation. Yep, it actually says that, holy walls of annihilation. Now, I must say that nobody else actually uses that kind of language. Because to be frank, nobody talks like that. Now, Israel refuses to cooperate with this UN commission, branding the commission as Hamas's proxies. Let us not forget that one of the UN special reporters actually called Hamas a political organization that must be protected. So the idea that the UN has now become a form of Hamas proxy is actually beyond the pale. Now, the US and the UK have distanced themselves from the finding, treating it as political grandstanding. Now, you see, that becomes problematic because the UN shouldn't be a political grandstanding organization. Now, the result is yet we have another stage act. The UN investigators write their script. Israel plays defiance, Western allies hedge their concerns but not conclusions, and no resolution is reached, just competing performances. So yet again, what we are finding is that politics has become performative. And we're going to ask the question at the end of this as to why it's become performative. But you see, that performative nature of politics is now having real-life effects against Israeli citizens and Jewish individuals as a whole. At the Emmy Awards, an actor wore a keffiyeh and denounced Israel for genocide and apartheid. Now, what exactly does this actor know about Israel and genocide? Well, nothing. But he thought, it's the moment and, I should join whatever's currently fashionable in the typical grandstanding way. Now, as you can imagine, many critics have noted that he never actually spoke up about massacres in Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Afghanistan. How about even Sudan, if we want to talk on the African continent? So his outrage is purely selective, but perfect for a red carpet statement, because that's what these things are. They're now the politics of the elite. They're the grandstanding of the elite. And nothing is worth more than grandstanding about the Israeli-Gaza conflict at the moment, even though this has real-life effects. Because as we've seen, Israelis like Gal Gadot face the opposite fate. She receives death threats and avoids making any form of public appearances, becoming a lightning rod simply for her identity. This is theatrics in its purest form. A complex geopolitical issue turned into a wardrobe choice and a PR soundbite. And the keffiyeh has become a costume for many of these virtue signalers.
Javier, right here, please. Thank you. Javier, right here, too. Javier, can I see your keffiyeh? Javier, right here.
Now, you know where else we've seen this? Well, we've actually seen it in the Eurovision Song Contest, because organizers have threatened to kick Israel out unless it performs under a neutral flag or withdraws for a year. Ireland, Slovenia, and the Netherlands say it will boycott the show if Israel competes. Not because Eurovision will end the war, but because cultural spectacles are a far more visible platform than diplomacy. In Spain, the Prime Minister celebrated protesters who disrupt Israeli athletes, encouraging them to do it again. They did, by the way, turn up the next day to disrupt these Israeli athletes, which again turned the event into a moral theater, and many athletes actually had to withdraw from the contest. Now, Europe's gestures don't change Gaza, but they do make for dramatic headlines and give politicians symbolic victories at home. And you've got to ask the question as to why they feel they need to have these symbolic victories at home over a Jewish state, a very small Jewish state, and an even smaller Gazan state. I mean, this actual place is like 40 kilometers long. I mean, the only other countries in the world that are competing for smallness in terms of size are probably the Vatican and Gibraltar. I mean, it is a really small space. Meanwhile, millions starve to death and die in conflict in Sudan. But nobody's talking about Sudan. But I'll tell you what they're also not talking about, and that's something that they should all be panicking over, and that is that Egypt has proposed a NATO-style Arab joint force that would enable defense of any Arab nation that's under attack. Now, this Arab joint force is meant to mimic NATO. Now, the idea being that, as you know, we've seen Israel launch operations in Jordan, and we've also seen them launch operations now in Qatar. The idea being that if any one of them had the Israelis bomb them for whatever reason, they would all en masse retaliate against Israel. Now, for Hamas and other Islamist groups, this is a theater they've long dreamed of. The idea that Israel's retaliation will trigger a pan-Arab military shield and ultimately lead to the complete destruction of Israel.
اليوم أنت تستطيع أن تقول أننا وصلنا إلى حالة الردع والدفاع عن الأرض المحتلة. لما نتكلم ان احنا جيش القدس ونتكلم عن معركة الوعد الآخرة، لا نتكلم فيها لأننا سنحرر أرضنا فقط، ولكن لأن ما قاله نبينا محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم عندما قال زوى الله تعالى لي الدنيا وفي لفظ آخر الأرض فرأيت مشارقها ومغاربها وأن ملك أمتي سيبلغ ما زوي لي منها. إنه 510 مليون كيلومتر مربع وهي مساحة كل أرضية سوف تعيش حالة لا ظلم فيها ولا قهر فيها ولا خيانة ولا صلة ولا مسيحية غادرة ولا قتل بهذه الحجم، هذه الجرائم التي ترتكب بحق الشعب الفلسطيني والشعب العربي في كل الدول العربية، سواء كانت في لبنان وسوريا وفي العراق وفي غيرها.
Now, realistically, Arab states remain divided, many unwilling to fight a war with Israel. And some have suggested this might purely be because of strength. And if they lack their appropriate strength, maybe they don't want to retaliate. But if they club together, maybe they actually have the strength in order to destroy the state completely. But the performance of announcing such a force gives the illusion of strength and emboldens extremists. And this is what all of these things are doing. They are emboldening extremists up and down the political aisle. Meanwhile, a Gazan peace activist, Rami Amin, exposed how Hamas controls the media, the UNRWA jobs, and aid distribution. So, according to him, this Gazan peace activist, Hamas actually controls the entire region. He says that if you aren't Hamas, you don't get UNRWA jobs. He says humanitarian aid stamped not for sale is looted and resold, and Hamas suppresses all peaceful protests inside Gaza whilst encouraging protests in Israel. Now, Imam himself was jailed after an Amnesty researcher publicly called on Hamas to arrest him. Can you believe that? Amnesty International, the one organization constantly condemning Israel for their genocidal acts, encouraged the arrest of a peace activist. And it wasn't for terrorism, but for promoting dialogue with Israel, because as we have to highlight time and time again, these people do not want to dialogue with Israel.
In 2020, we organized a big conference between 10 Gazans and 300 Israelis. We were talking about Corona, not talking about one state or two states or talking about negotiation. We were talking about how we can save each other. And 2 days later, I found a post started from a journalist working with Amnesty called Hind al-Khudari, asking Hamas and mentioned Hamas leaders in Facebook for arrest me. And that happened just the day later. This has surprised me from the first time, because when I checked Hind al-Khudari profile, I saw that she is working with Amnesty and she is a journalist, and I know that she is a US fellow. So for me, how come Amnesty is calling for my arrest? How come a journalist asking the securities to arrest me? In that time, I felt that, okay, before I know that we have a lot of corruption in the civil society, inside Gaza and outside Gaza, but not in that way, because it's no fair. You are talking about the human rights.
Now, this story shows how human rights organizations meant to protect individuals have become actors in the very drama that they were set up to protect against. They're arresting peace activists whilst condemning states for war crimes. I mean, where's the logic in this? So as we've seen in previous story, UN experts accuse Israel of deliberately killing journalists to cover up genocide. Israel counters that Hamas started the war with massacres and hostages, and each side plays to its own audience. Israel frames self-defense, the UN frames genocide, and the truth is buried beneath layers of staged narratives. Britain bans students but denies genocide. The UN declares genocide but lacks enforcement. Hollywood turns into fashion. Europe boycotts souls and sports but not weapons. Arab states boast of armies that will never mobilize. NGOs jail peace activists whilst preaching human rights. Everyone is on a stage and no one is solving the conflict, because politics is nothing more these days than theatrics. So this is problematic, because the media is the stage and the politicians are the fools. So you may look at all of this and say, well, why is it all occurring? And the answer is actually very easy to understand, and that is mass migration. Because mass migration has meant that many from the East have moved to the West, and when moving to the West, these individuals become largely vocal. Their issues are forced into the psyche of the hosting nation, and the reality is that nation, in order to appease those individuals, are having to give lip service to the issue in question. And this is problematic, because you cannot have a moral position on any topic whilst trying to give lip service to the very individuals that don't share your morality.
Illegal immigration is a well-orchestrated business for the orchestrators to make a fortune and to Islamize Europe. You have filled our countries with illegal migrants with the blessing of Germany and France. We pay Islam that hates us out of our savings to turn our cities into ghettos, to rape and to murder before our eyes in the name of Allah. We are filled with Muhammad and Mahmoud in a Europe that has become unrecognizable. There are solutions. Strengthen by all means the countries that are the first entry points, such as Greece, Italy, and Spain. Those who enter European territory illegally They should receive no benefits. They should receive no asylum. They should be arrested. They should have their mobile phones confiscated. They should be taken to uninhabited islands, and then they should be deported to their country or countries outside of the European Union. Stop subsidizing their accommodation and subsidize their deportation. Our guiding light ought to be the policies of Hungary and of and Poland. It's quite clear that those who violate our borders are entering their unwanted guests, and they're destroying our countries. So begin mass deportations immediately. Money exists. Airports exist. Detention centers are there. Kick them out before Europe dies. We want our countries, our identity, and our values. And if you so-called sensitive socialists, well, why don't you look at yourselves? Because you are the biggest racists against Europe.
In any case, these are just my views. Do let me know what you think in the comment section below. Do you also look at the politicians these days and just think they're all a bunch of performing clowns? Let me know. Until next time, bye.
The country can't support terrorism and still expect to be treated as a member of the international community. To take hostages is to exclude yourself from the civilized world.